thank you very, very much for joining us this morning. The session actually has changed from defending democracy in the Golden Triangle to defending democracy in Myanmar. And of course, it's probably Asia's biggest security crisis in the region at the moment. So it's incredibly important to talk about this. So I'll introduce the panelists, and we've got a written thing coming up now. But Ben Bland, who's from Chatham House, who is in charge of Asia Pacific programs. Thida, activist, writer, surgeon, force of nature. And, she's written an amazing book about the Spring Revolution, which is what we're going to talk about. And over on this corner here, we've got Phan Duong Tran, a journalist, an activist currently serving 9 years jail in Vietnam for conducting propaganda, a crime, frequently used to jail dissidents. Ma, why don't you start by reading out what she stands for as, the representative of PEN and also someone who's been locked up in insane prison, arguably Asia's worst jail.
Hello. Oh, okay. Yeah, indeed. One of our traditional PEN International Writer in Prison Committee, we encourage and promote the prosecuted writer as the empty chair cases. Here is from Vietnam, Phan Dong Trang. She is a writer, journalist, and pro-democracy activist who is currently serving a 9-year prison sentence after her appeal was rejected by the Hanoi People's High Court on 25th August 2022. Trang is regarded as one of Vietnamese most prominent human rights activists and is the author of several books, including Politics of a Police State and Non-Violent Resistance. She has received multiple awards in recognition of her advocacy work, including the 2022 Martin Annals Award and PEN America's 2024 PEN Barbe Freedom to Write Award. In October 2020, Trang was arrested at her home and charged with conducting propaganda against the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, an allegation frequently used to imprison dissident writers and human rights activists. While detained, she was denied access to legal counsel and medical care for over a year, raising serious concerns in relation to her pre-existing health conditions such as low blood pressure and chronic pain resulting from her legs being severely injured from a previous assault by the police. Despite her unjust detention drawing international condemnation, including from the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on 14 December 2021, she was sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. On 1st October 2022, she was transferred to a prison located approximately 100 kilometers north of Ho Chi Minh City, further hampering visits from her family and legal representatives.
Okay, and thank you for that. Thank you for that. And Ben, you actually personally know her. Can you tell her anything to add apart from the written write-up?
Yeah, thanks, Drew, and thanks, Thida. Yeah, I used to be a journalist based in Hanoi. I was a correspondent there for the Financial Times from, I think, 2010 to 2012, so a long time ago now. But I did meet Trang a few times when I was in Hanoi. I didn't know her well, but she was definitely a curious and fearless journalist in a place that's undeniably a very hard place to be a journalist, even for foreign correspondents, but even more so for Vietnamese people who face far more constraints on the kinds of things they can do. And I think it should obviously go without saying that no one should be jailed for reporting and writing accurate things about what's happening in their country. But I think it also has to go without saying that is actually a commonplace here in the region we're in, definitely in Vietnam. And I think it goes to show while it's easy to sit in these festivals, especially for people you are from the region, and sort of talk about fighting for democracy, actually there are real costs involved for people doing that. And it's tough. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, on Myanmar, the costs are extremely punishing.
So in the spirit of her and Myanmar and everything else, let's start by actually talking about what is democracy. What are we defending? Ben, I want to talk, half the world will or have voted in 2024. It's a year where think tanks and journalists said democracy would face a stress test. But let's look at Asia now, from Taiwan to Sri Lanka and even here in Indonesia. There's been a pretty smooth transition of power. People power toppled a very nasty despot in Sheikh Hasina over in Bangladesh. And Narendra Modi didn't have a thumping victory as was predicted in India. So my first question to you is, has Asia fared pretty well when it comes to, defending democracy, or is there more to it?
Yeah, it's a good point, and you've taken most of my talking points, Drew. So I'm not sure I should thank you for that. Obviously, there's an election to come in a few weeks in a small country somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, but I think we all know that one's pretty irrelevant. Although I am talking about it in a couple of days, so come along to that. I think actually, yeah, it's largely, despite what I said at the start, quite a good story for democracy in Asia. I mean, the first thing I'll say is we hear a lot of talk in the region about Asian values and a different perspective on what democracy means. But I think it is important to understand that pretty much every country in the world signed on to universal human rights in the UN Charter. So there is, to some degree, a common understanding of what democracy means in a general sense in human rights. But I think when it comes to elections and free and fair elections, actually, as you say, Asia has seen a pretty good series of elections. We've seen, the world's biggest democracy, India, where Narendra Modi was expected to get this huge majority that would potentially allow him to shift the constitution. That didn't happen. In Indonesia, there was a free and fair contest with really high turnout. There's regional elections coming up across Indonesia next month, including in Bali. If you see the pictures of people with a nail next to them, that's how people vote in Indonesia, by punching a nail through the ballot paper. So Indonesia's going to the polls, free and fair elections. Taiwan, Sri Lanka, peaceful transition. And in Bangladesh, as you said, students effectively ousted Sheikh Hasina, who'd been really deeply, deeply unpopular. So I think broadly it's quite a positive story, but I think we have to remember democracy isn't a sort of vase in a museum. It's not this sort of delicate thing that we have to keep. It's a battle. It's a battle for power between parties, between ethnic groups, between interests, between businesses and societies. And I think everywhere in the world, we've got to bear that in mind. And I think it was always naive to assume the world was on some sort of trajectory towards perfected democracy, which I think is why people talk about democratic backsliding, which to me makes no sense. That assumes we were all moving towards this perfect model. But it's always a fight everywhere with different costs. But broadly in Asia, things have gone quite well this year. Myanmar being like a very, very obvious example of things going in completely the wrong direction.
And let's go to Myanmar. Like, we're seeing amazing, there was democracy and there was elections just before the coup. And then Aung San Suu Kyi's party was elected, and then just as they entered the parliament, the army stormed in and took control of the power. Aung San Suu Kyi is still in jail, and the country remains at war. People who have been ousted, what kind of democracy do they want, Ma? Because, the parliament had a quarter of military officials in the parliament, and all the vital posts, like the security posts, were held by the military. So if democratic powers do fight back and win, what does new democracy have to look like in Myanmar?
Well, hello. Is it okay?
Yeah, I think it's on, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is the understanding of democracy in Myanmar by our own people is a little bit different from the understanding of democracy from outsiders, For that reason, since the 2010 election onwards, quasi-civilian administrations 2 times under very pro-military quasi-civilian government and anti-military quasi-civilian administrations for 5 years. These 10 years means a lot to the outsiders as democracy. But for us, for Myanmar people, it was totally not, because we know not the elections, not the only measurable indicators for having democracy, because we believe democracy is a culture. It's not by the structural related administration. So for that reason, I wrote the current book, the Amazed. Yeah, tomorrow I will present. So during these 10 years time, everybody thought we have been gone on the road to democracy already. Then after the coup, people started saying, Myanmar stands the U-turn, Myanmar make a U-turn back to the military administration, the military coup. But my argument is, no, we were never been to anywhere else in these 10 years' time. We were in a maze. It's because of this 25% presence in the parliaments by the military. It's a very well assigned reserve post for the military. And not just of that, 3 ministers, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of the Border Affairs and Ministry of Home Affairs, including all the armed forces, legitimate armed forces, is under direct control of Commander-in-Chief. Not just that, the Chief Justice is ex-military officer according to the 2008 Constitution. For that reason, this 10 years time, we were only in a maze. We never been on the road to democracy. But with more relaxation of the censorship and other sort of the civil liberties, very, very few, everybody outside think, oh, we already on the road to democracy. It was not. There is no democratic culture, and political dialogue culture has been deeply rooted these days. So military still keep its control all the way through. And finally, in 2021, since the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi won again the election in 2020, military lost confidence. The real concern is they might not even grip any part of the power consolidation beyond 2021. For that reason, Myanmar decided to take this coup. But even in these 10 years' time, military control every single part and structure of the country already. So there is no such proper democracy. What we're fighting for right now is to having not just the structural change, but also the cultural change of democracy in the country.
And it's very easy to be very disenchanted with the state of the world with Gaza and Ukraine. But like in 2024, we have seen a coalition of ethnic armies really take the fight very, very hard to the army, take back territory, take back towns, garrison towns, and really it's an equal playing field right now. And some analysts are looking and saying, hey, the democratic forces might actually win this. Like, to both of you, does it surprise you how well the ethnic forces have fought back against the army?
Yeah, it's really surprising. I always prefer the peaceful resistance, not the armed resistance. And for the very beginning, we have no confidence about the people's decisions to make the armed resistance, because without training, without enough funding, without enough weapons, how can they fight? But within this 3.5 years' times, it's really amazing. It's not just with the former ethnic armed forces. It's with the newly recruited People Defense Forces. They all decided to do this because the atrocities on the ground by the military is overwhelming and too much beyond our imagination. It's totally unbearable. That's why people think, okay, this is the only way out. And with the decision of the remarkable thing is in 2020 election, in November 2020 election, the first-time voters population is almost 500,000, over 500,000. So these young people, they cannot bear seeing that their vote has been rejected, their vote has been not recognized. For that reason, they stood up with their new knowledge in the digital feeds, etc. They started changing the whole scenario of the armed conflict. You know, they invented their own drone, and they even printed the arms through the 3D printer, something like that. So the way they have been changing the scenario with the armed resistance, right now, it's almost 90 cities on the ground has been under their hands. The People Defense Forces together with the former ethnic armed forces. That's not just mean the number, it means around about over 60% of the land has been controlled well by the resistance forces. For that reason, current military, coup military is now using airstrikes as a weapon. But their target is not just to the defense forces. Their target is civilians, simply to the civilians. Nursery schools, hospitals, churches, and monastery everywhere, because they really want the resistance forces bearing such a big burden, because the internally displaced persons after 2021 till now is almost 3.5 million already.
And Ben, just like, what about like the Gen X and the Milk Tea Alliance in kind of fueling this fight back? how important have the youth been in kind of taking the fight to the army?
Yeah, I think it's very important. And if you look at any conflict, I think the willingness to fight is always, as important, if not more important, than the ability to fight. So, of course, the weapons, the organization, that matters. But just people being willing to risk their lives and to die, because that's obviously what's happening, is a key factor. And here, I think, is the degree of space that opened up in Myanmar in the sort of decade before the coup. It did matter, right, to a lot of young people. While you're right, of course, the military retained a lot of the levers of power behind the scenes, there was a huge flourishing of kind of space for people to speak their minds, to do business, to travel. I mean, I remember when I was first in Myanmar in 2011, you couldn't get a SIM card. Yeah, the taxis had holes in the floor because it was impossible to import any vehicles, basically. And going back in 2020, before the coup, and seeing, how things were was so different. So I think for a lot of young people, there's that sense of loss. Always think for all humans, loss aversion is something that really affects our sense of who we are. It's not necessarily about what you can gain, but when you feel you've lost something, personal freedom, that really grates. And I think that's what potentially is driving people to be willing to risk so much. So I think, a lot of people from the outside have been surprised by both the willingness to fight and also the degree of unity between the disparate ethnic armed groups and the former political party of Aung San Suu Kyi, despite some of their ongoing differences. But what I would say is we can't forget, and obviously as Thida points out, how brutal the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military is, and also that it existed before the modern state of Burma or Myanmar, before there was a Burma or Myanmar, as the end, in the dying days of British colonial rule, there was, the army led by Aung San Suu Kyi's father. So the military has been there before the state, and so I don't think they're going to easily give up. And people might say, is Myanmar then a failed state? Well, I think it's just going to be a very contested state for a long time to come. And that's the fear, that actually there's going to be brutal conflict for years or even decades.
And Ma, the other ingredient in the mix, apart from the youth, apart from armies on the ground, is there is a pretty strong government in exile that is an alternative government that could take over if democracy is returned. But how hard will it be, given what Ben has said, like long periods of colonial rules, many coups, the army, an ever-present force in civil society? If a civilian government does take over again, how hard will it be for them to implement a true democracy?
Well, it's a very, very hard, of course, because of the, as you said, because of the very long term, almost a century colonizations. I think the identity politics is very strong on Earth. So it's a very, very difficult situation. But I think the 2021 coup making us more understanding each other between the different ethnic groups. And we also aim one collective dreams is to knock down the military dictatorship first before we introduced or we implement the federal democracy for the longer run. Right now, the National Unity Government, formed by the partly elected members of parliament according to the election and partly representatives from the other ethnic armed forces and other ethnic political parties or the civil society organization, is not the government in exile. At least 20% of the members of the cabinet of National Unity Government still on the ground, literally on the ground inside the country. They are managing in different perspectives. This government is neither, not just the pretty mixed the de facto and de jure legitimacy, but also it's not just simple revolutionary government, because it's not just making the armed resistance or the peaceful resistance, because the Spring Revolution is doing both, not just armed, but also like the boycott to the products by the military and boycotts to some other military granted facility, something like that. So the peaceful protest is still going on. But for the National Unity Government, it also provides some other public services like the healthcare and the education on the ground in the area where the resistance forces control. The National Unity Government giving vaccination, giving from the kindergarten to the college or university level education through online or through on the ground also. So it's a very hard situation, but as much as we could, we all get together. The role of the diaspora is also playing very important in the national unity government. It's still very challenging because of the different aim, different dream among these different groups, but we all pretty much cooperated to make the current military coup down. That's the strongest point right now.
So Ben, based on what Ma has said and these multiple complicated actors in play in the democratic resistance, how do we stop Myanmar not becoming like Yugoslavia, balkanizing? Because the ethnic armies have played a big role in this fight back. How do we, what do the international community have to do to ensure that Myanmar is stable and doesn't become this exploding situation into Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh?
Well, I think right now, the outside world isn't really doing much or not much that's constructive. I think it's fair to say. And that's the first thing we have to recognize. We just live in such a different world from the time of the interventions in the former Yugoslavia. I don't know if anyone here remembers the phrase, responsibility to protect, which was quite fashionable in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This idea that, the international community, which was normally code for the US and its allies or the West, not always, that there was this obligation to go into countries where they had internal strife to fix things for their own benefit. Well, that was completely discredited by Afghanistan, by Iraq, and also the world has just moved on to a much more kind of self-interested, pick and mix a la carte world where countries sort of take and pick and choose the principles and issues they want to get involved in. So I just think we have to acknowledge we are in a very different world. But I think even given that, there are some basic things that could be done. So I think the first thing would be some higher degree of coordination on sanctions for countries that do bring in sanctions, which is mostly Western governments and US allies, but having some sort of high degree of coordination to make sure that where the military is trying to get access to fuel, obviously not many Western countries are selling weapons directly, but there's things like fuel, parts, technology, finance. There's some more that could be done there to try and make it harder for them to get access to the material, to get the weapons to kill lots of civilians and innocent people. I think that's one thing. I think at a diplomatic level, there's a bit more that a few key countries that have either an interest or some leverage in Myanmar could do to talk to each other about the situation. That's not going to solve it, because I think ultimately it's going to be a fight between the people on the ground that will resolve things, a fight in terms of weapons, but also political fight. But I think if you had China, India, Bangladesh, a few key ASEAN countries, Australia, the US, the EU, maybe the UK come together, I think there's something they could do to maybe coordinate humanitarian assistance a bit better, something they could do to share their views to make sure at least where they're getting involved. And China and India as neighbors have very different interests from faraway partners like the US or Australia or the UK, that at least they're cooperating a bit more. And just the last thing I'll say, there is some signs for hope. So the Myanmar ambassador to the UN in New York, who's still in place, is the former ambassador who was there before the coup. So the person who basically was put there by the more democratic, not perfect, but the more democratic government. And China and the US and others have effectively agreed to keep that person in place. So it shows there is some potential for outside powers to cooperate in the margins, but I don't think that's going to solve the fundamental problems on the ground, but it might alleviate some of the pressures and cut off some of the junta's ability to kind of rearm and sustain its campaign against its own people.
So, Ma, looking domestically within Myanmar, do ethnic minorities need more of a seat at the table in a future democratic government led by Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD party? If they do end up taking back control of Myanmar, will ethnic minorities need more of a seat at the table?
Sure, yeah. That's why we just want to change the constitution also. But not just with this thing. The crisis right now is not just getting back to the status quo before the 2021. We want to have a new, very different structure. No more 2008 constitution, quasi-civilian, that kind of administration. There is no such thing, because since there is, according to the 2008 constitution, it is two upper house and lower house style, two parliaments, but it's not working for the ethnic minorities having concrete states. So it should also be changed. For that reasons, most of the ethnic groups, they prefer to have the federal democracy, something like that. So we are now thinking about the new structure, not just the unitary system, but also the power sharing among the federal government and the states government. In that sense, we might need more new infrastructure right now. For that reason, it sounded like our resistance right now is pretty much not well organized, not well united, and not well kind of the harmonized. But in one sense, for example, like one small little area in the south, it has already been its own administration, its own new parliaments, not well recognized by the other, but it has been pretty much improvement, not just with their own ethnic people, but also with the other different ethnic people, encourage them to weigh on that road. So it's not like the balkanization. It sounded like we know that according to the geography, we are in very, very difficult situation between China and India. And right now, China is using its ultimate kind of the approach to pressure both sides, not just the military, but also to the ethnic armed forces. But it sounded like recently China has been more preference to the military coup leaders, supporting its with the weapons and everything. But the situation right now with not just with the China, because of China, Russia is also involved. So the whole scenario around us is making us more and more challenging. For that reason, I think, to be frank, the Western democracy or the other democratic countries ever think, the Myanmar as a proxy to China. So we really don't want to be seen as proxy. We want to be seen as our own. We really want the international actors to think seriously about our situation is not very simple compared to the other hot topics. We also having such a big atrocities on the ground. The total number of the casualties after the 2021 by the military itself, it's almost, I think it's a bit more than 10,000, but it's very hard to get the real number. So it's thought to be almost 30,000 already. Internally displaced is 3.5 million, but externally displaced like myself is another million, something like that. So altogether is 6 or 7 million Myanmars all over, especially in the Thai border, and the other part of the country is losing our identity also. So that's not just the security intervention or the humanitarian assistance. We need more than that. We need more than this kind of.
And you've raised the geopolitics of this situation. Then, obviously economic sanctions and, doing things with oil could bring this war to a real end. However, the army can turn to China and Russia and get money in that way. They don't, like Western sanctions don't necessarily work. So these international players, how do we kind of deal with that? Because they are very important players in Myanmar.
Yeah, the world has changed in the last few decades. So it's not just that, as I was saying earlier, we've lost sort of the ambition to fix things, but global economic power has shifted so much that it's true that people can turn to China. I mean, most of the region looks to China as their main trading partner, key source of investment and new technologies, and that's obviously the case for the junta, trying to resolve their relationships there. I think, China and India play such an important role, obviously, as key neighbors, and their perspective is just so different. I mean, I think they would just look at Myanmar from a perspective of conflict management, not conflict resolution. They don't want to resolve it, not even conflict mitigation, but just manage this. How can we make sure there aren't refugees over our border? How can we make sure that the ethnic armed groups we're working with aren't attacking us, or that the junta is not mistakenly sort of firing shells over our border? But in a way, that gives them an interest in some kind of stability, not necessarily democracy. And I think the truth is, if you want to look towards some kind of solutions, they have to be involved. They're the neighbors. They have leverage. They have influence. I think there's some ability to talk to each other. But it's really hard when we're living in a world when the US and its allies are sort of aligning against China as this kind of new chief dividing line from our world. It's really hard to sit down and say, what can we do together. But I think China has a certain pragmatism, right? So before the coup, actually, Aung San Suu Kyi and the Chinese government were getting quite close just because of practical cooperation and because actually the military is quite prickly about China historically as well. So I think China will work with whoever can help it maintain its interests. And I think it's hard to imagine some sort of Western imposed solution that doesn't involve China and India and potentially Russia as well, which has growing influence as the junta has been cut off from other partners and Russia likes to cause nuisance in the world. They've definitely seen an opening. I think there were a few Russian naval frigates on doing exercises within Myanmar Navy in the last few weeks, which is obviously really concerning. But I think that should highlight, hopefully to us, that the world is connected and that we can't just say that's a far-off conflict, that has nothing to do with us. We should have a stake, and I'm not saying that we can resolve it alone, but I think it's about talking to partners who see things differently, having difficult conversations. That's really what's necessary.
And you raised refugees going over the border in that answer. Obviously, the Rohingya refugee crisis of 2017, it is a worrying aspect to maintaining stability in Myanmar. Like, I was there covering the genocide in both northern Rakhine and Myanmar. I mean, in your book, Ma, you say, it was the army that was doing the killing. The army was to blame. But, as someone who was there on both sides of the border, I think the civil society was just as complicit in banning the hate speech and making, referring to Rohingya in really awful terms. I fear history repeating itself. Doesn't civil society have much to blame for the Rohingya crisis as, the military?
Well, yeah, that's the point. We having gone through the very severe censorship and heavy propaganda since 1962. So the terms Rohingya has been completely eliminated after 1970s. So for that reason, the civil society, for them, what it is, they really don't know who they are. That's the problem. That's why I blame the military. The consecutive militant military government, military dictatorship has been used both censorship, propaganda, and poor, ineffective education to blind the whole society. For that reason, obviously, there is some civil society on the ground, especially in the Rakhine state. They just fueling the hate speech. The weapon military uses not just the guns, but also the hate speech campaign and the heavy propaganda is severely affected to the civil society. So that's why I blame military, not just the civil society. Obviously, I know the people on the ground is also responsible for the hate speech campaign, but they, the follower of the narratives, very, very subtly handled by the military from the very beginning. It has been more than so many decades. For that reason, for them, it's they really don't know. I normally said that our society is intellectually blind, and we live in the virtual reality, even though we literally live physically. But most of the things, what's going on beyond our territory, is very distant to us. That's very simple. The techniques of the military that's why I always say the game changer will be the right to information and the freedom of expression. Otherwise, we will be in that kind of halo.
And I get what you're saying, but here's another tough question for you. Is Aung San Suu Kyi the right person to lead a new Myanmar? Because I know you say the military did the killing, but she was the one defending them in the Hague and I know they were the ones who put her back in jail. But to create true unity, is she the right political figure in a new democratic government?
I'm afraid to say it, to be frank. Making her as a one and only leader is not responsible for our people. It's the international media and international community, From the very beginning in 1988, when she came back from England, and she was not very well known as a one and only leader. And people were a little bit confused why she left for so long, and all of a sudden she came back and doing something. But after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, it's the whole international media and community just talk about her as one and only leader. You know, a lot of the civil society, small leaders and writers and some other people has been undermined already. Our voices cannot go through beyond her voice, something like that. So that reason, for the general public, as I said, intellectually blind people, they also rely on the input from the international community. Okay, since these people, they are educated, they are democratic people, since these people believe in her, why don't we believe in her? Something like that. So she was not the one and only unity leader for the country, even since then. You know, there are some other people trying to do something. She's trying to represent the states at the ICJ, as far as I understood. You know, the pressure is the way, as I write in my book, the perspectives from the military on her move to the Hague is, you know, she's trying to behave as someone who represent the whole country and win the next election in 2020. That's the military's impression. They never ever feel that they have been well coordinated by her. They have been well protected by her. But from the international community, you guys think she's cooperated with the military well. That was not true. It's already been proved. Right now, we really don't know where she is, whether she's still alive or not. They sent her to the prison, say, we really don't know how the condition in there. If she cooperates with the military very well, she might not be ended up in this sense, something like that. So the perspectives from the Rohingya community and the perspectives of the other different ethnic groups in the country towards her standing up at the ICJ also very different.
I think,
very, very different.
So just to add quickly on Aung San Suu Kyi, I mean, it is a problem that we have, right? Like as a former journalist, as someone who works in a think tank, we want to make stories simple for people. So tying it to one kind of hero makes it easy, but the world is more complicated like that. And it was quite sad how Aung San Suu Kyi was both built up by the Western world, but then dropped as a total pariah afterwards when things went wrong. Whereas the solutions to Myanmar are going to be complex and messy.
So we've got about 20 minutes to go because this wraps up at 12:15 and it's 11:50. We've talked about democracy, but what about the military? They're resorting to conscripting Rohingya and people to fight in the army. They want an election next year. They're asking for a lot right now. Is it an act of desperation? Like what is the motivation of the military? Because right now they are still in power. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. They are really interested in the term using then the conflict management. I think the military, what it's doing with the coming up election, so-called coming up election, is making the conflict transformation, not the conflict resolution. So I truly believe international community should not be misled by the military to make the conflict transform, not manage, not resolute, So what we want is not the election. According to our experience in 1990, the previous military made this 1990 election, but it didn't happen to having any government beyond that, The whole result of the 1990 election has been simply vanished by the military. So according to our experience, all the election doesn't mean any future for the democracy. So I rather afraid is our conflict should not be transformed. Our conflict should be only resolute.
And Ben, despite all the atrocities that the military has committed, is the reality that they will be needed in some way, shape or form in a future administration? I mean, look at good old Indonesia. The current president, the foreign minister, the defense minister are all old army men. They're very good at kind of taking control of countries. Will the military or ex-generals have to be a force of governance in Myanmar?
Well, it's a horrible job being a geopolitical analyst because it's activists' job to dream of a better world, and then it's our job to sort of say that's probably not going to happen, unfortunately. And yeah, I do think if you look at it realistically, as I said earlier, the military in Myanmar has been there for the state. They have no compunction about brutalizing their own people to a really extreme degree. They're a huge force. They're backed by powerful supporters. in China, in Russia, elsewhere. The rest of the world is turning away. So I do think, as most governments in the region look at it, they would think at the end of the day, yeah, that's the pattern in the rest of the region. Look around Southeast Asia, and, militaries are quite key to power structures. They would probably envisage the military are going to have to be part of the solution. And obviously, in a sense, it's on opposition forces in Myanmar to show that that's not the case. And I think that's why the military is so keen to push towards this election, because they sense that for maybe definitely for Thailand, perhaps for even some of the other Southeast Asian neighbors, they would like to have some sort of fig leaf election in Myanmar, so they can say, oh, well, it wasn't perfect, Aung San Suu Kyi or the National League for Democracy couldn't stand, but at least it's better than nothing. Now let's fully normalize relations and get on with things. But I don't think Myanmar can't go back to the status quo ante. It's going to be, even if there are elections, there's going to be violence. It's going to be very different. So I think the neighbors who envisage have a fig leaf election, normalize with the junta, and then they'll just get on sort of killing people here and there, and we can do business with Myanmar as normal. That's not going to happen. It's going to be something different and much messier.
And my final question before we throw to 15 minutes of questions is, there's been so much violence through airstrikes, so much displacement, so much poverty in Myanmar. Whoever inherits this is inheriting a mess. But before you kind of deal with governance, as someone who has been in jail, and for all the dissidents that are currently in jail, doesn't there need to be some form of truth and reconciliation committee to bring these ethnic people together to, come to terms with what 60% of the generals in the army have done, which is to commit mass murder? Isn't truth and reconciliation the first step before we even think of governance?
Definitely. I always keep talking about the transitional justice. And even just before the 2015 election, first time ever NLD won. At that time, I wrote an article at the Huffington Post about the seriousness of the transitional justice through the Truth and Reconciliation Bill, not as a bill, not as the process, because it sounded like the peace process in 2011 by the Thein Sein government, military quasi-civilian government, is, for me, it's trying to make the conflict transform, not the resolute. For that reason, my point is we better have the Truth and Reconciliation as a bill with the will of the people at the parliament, and then according to this, we should design the process of the transitional justice. Even in just before 2015, but nobody paid much attention to my point, and then we keep going on that. So I really go for it. That should be done.
I've still got one little bit of time. Ben, just on the back of that, the world has been reading a lot about Myanmar, Gaza, Ukraine. It's a very complicated geopolitical space, but why should the world care about Myanmar right now? Even in Asia, there's the South China Sea, the invasion of Taiwan. So much is going on. Why should they care about Myanmar?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's really sad as a former journalist seeing sort of how media coverage goes, where it's sort of like Gaza in the news, Ukraine drops out, Ukraine in the news, Gaza drops out, not to mention, Myanmar and lots of other conflicts in other parts of the world that get almost no attention ever. I think the first thing to say is, it could happen to you, right? I mean, maybe not in exactly the same way. All our countries and cultures are different, but there's nothing that we should take for granted about democracy. I think the US election in a few weeks is going to show us that. The UN Charter, so all countries in the world, including Russia and China, who've been on the Security Council in the start, they signed up to the universal human rights that we're all talking about today. And I think the last thing I'd say is the geopolitics and the spillover effect. So I think in Southeast Asia, we've already seen the spillover effects of refugee flows into Indonesia, into Malaysia, into Thailand, into India and Bangladesh as well. We've seen these scam centers and the proliferation of kind of online of northern Myanmar, where it's really lawless, and China as well on groups that use these online scam centers to make money and to steal money from people all around the world. So there are direct effects, there are moral reasons. I mean, hopefully all that should be enough, but sadly I fear that it's not. Okay, based on my watch, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So anyone wants to ask, I might get you guys to trade the mic because it's been cutting out. But yeah, please, we've got a question back there and we'll take these two questions first.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm as confused as ever, trying to reduce complexity to simplicity. Australia will be having a federal election sometime next year. if I was to go to a meet the candidate session in my local constituency, what might be one basic thing I think Australia could be doing to help Myanmar? Thank you.
I think, yeah, indeed, we are in emergency. We cannot wait anymore for 1 or 2 or 3 more years. So I think the issue should be seriously discussed at the UN Security Council again. The resolution 2 years ago, it's without any concrete activities. It sounded like just the statement. So we really don't want that kind of thing. So all the country pushing that things also. And on the other hand, I really prefer to having more humanitarian assistance through not the military, but through the non-military stakeholders. There are several others, including the National Unity Government. And that point is there are so many people like myself living outside, and we don't literally have kind of the proper immigration status or the visa or some other kind of the this kind of program. So it should be well taken by any country. It's much needed. Otherwise, we turn out to be no existing individual, yeah, it's beyond statelessness, the sense of security also pretty much needed. That can easily be done by the your consulates or your society, your community, your government, your parliaments. They are having some kind of the bill on taking care of the Myanmar people, either outside of Myanmar. It's also been very helpful. And on top of that, the key stress right now is to release all the political prisoners. The top one from Aung San Suu Kyi to right now, it's almost 30,000 political prisoners in prisons. So it should be released as soon as possible. The military cannot stop the atrocities. Recently, they burnt down one cities, and they even chopped the people's organ and spreading all over the village. Nastily, 2 days ago, it's unbearable. They even took pictures and video and posted to make the other people fear, So that kind of atrocity is going on. So, yeah, do something related to your capacity. Thank you.
Maybe.
This is Famar. Is there any opportunity, do you think, for your country to break up into different ethnic groups?
Yeah, it's a question on balkanization. Could it balkanize and break up into different groups?
Well, it might turn out, but right now I don't think it can easily be done because not just the according to the demography, it's really hard to have one ethnic state by its own. Without neglecting the other minorities in its own. For example, like in Rakhine State, Rakhine might say, yeah, they own the fighting and the conquering most of the space, but as we know, there is Rohingya people. There is some other far more small minority group like Muru, that so many different groups living in that area. For that reason, it sounded like balkanization, but for me, all the people know that should not be like this, But we need to having more kind of the power sharing between the central and the state's government. That's the form a lot of the ethnic groups are looking for, not just having their own independence. It's very hard right now because of the demography.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hello. Does it work? Doesn't work. Can you hear me or not?
A little bit. I'll try and...
First of all, I'd just like to declare I'm not Australian, but European, Dutch to be more specific. Thank you for all your comments about what international and particularly Western countries could do to help the situation in Myanmar. I think it's unlikely to be at the forefront of their minds given all the other things going on in the world. But I'd like you to comment on 3 other stakeholders which are more proximate to Myanmar. First of all, Thailand and the military government there, or the current sort of democratic government, as they call it. Secondly, ASEAN. And thirdly, the Buddhist community and the monks. I'm interested in your perspectives. My perspective is that the Thai military government is sort of friends with the Burmese military government and therefore don't do much. The ASEAN community is more a talk shop and cannot invade in the other countries or intervene in the other countries. Militarily, they could do so. Singapore has a great, strong army, and if they want to do something in Myanmar, they collectively could, but they don't. I'm not quite sure what the status is of the Burmese monks, but maybe you can comment on all three. Thank you.
Well, I think the society has been pretty much overwhelmed and manipulated by the government already. So among the Buddhist monks, the pro-military and anti-military division is also going on, and it has been handled very well by the military right now. So for the ASEAN, role of the ASEAN and role of the Thailand, we really prefer, to be frank, I always prefer not the military intervention by the international community, but the security intervention. The physical presence of the neighboring country forces will be helping not to making the too much extreme atrocities by the military right now, or rejecting the fuel. It will be the one of the things right now. The hardest atrocities right now is the airstrikes. I think within this 4 years' time, the total number of airstrike is almost 10,000 already, and it's very, very effective on the ground. So for that reason, and we understand the Thai society, Thai general society has been in dilemma. They really envy our fight, because their situation is more or less in a maze also. For that reasons, they really envy our revolution, but they having a burden. The society is having a burden. But compared to the society, the Thai government, Thai political elites having another different idea. It's also affected by the pressure from China and the US also. So at the same time, the ASEAN, for example, I really appreciate the Indonesia government is very, very much proactive in the sense of solving our problems from the sense of the people. So the Indonesia, Philippines, and even in Singapore, it's in okay. But like Cambodia, Laos, they are more or less controlled not by their own dictatorship government, but also by China. So the whole neighboring situation is not very well supported for us.
While the microphone moves to someone else, then what about the 5-point consensus that ASEAN has tried to push to solve this crisis? Has it really worked?
It hasn't worked, but I think that's not necessarily ASEAN's fault. I think potentially Southeast Asian countries could have done more. But I think what we see is the real divisions in the region between the more democratic governments and the less democratic ones. That's just a fact of politics. I think Thailand's position, to be honest, is a bit more complicated, right? A lot of the activists, a lot of the former democracy activists and others from Myanmar are based in Thailand. Thailand tolerates quite a lot of cross-border movements. Thailand also has to deal with the direct effects of kind of refugee flows, of managing the conflict on its own borders. And Thailand and Southeast Asia and China and India, they're not going anywhere, right? They're going to be a geographic fact for Myanmar. So I think they have to be part of the way forward. But I think they could do a bit more. I think the problem is that the neighboring countries and other people around the world are just tiring of it, right? The coup is now, almost 3.5, 4 years on. People just don't want to hear about Myanmar anymore. But I think it's important that Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, the countries that have informal talks with the different democracy activists, democracy groups, ethnic armed groups, continue those talks and not try and fully normalize relationships with the junta. But I say they're fighting against their own weariness and the push from some of the other ASEAN members. So I think it's going to be difficult.
I think we've got a little bit of time. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I was just interested in when you said that the resistance have been 3D printing their weaponry and this kind of thing in order to try and fight the military. I was wondering that they seem to have made very good headway, if you can call making headway in a war impressive. Where are they getting their arms from? Primarily, are they coming from within the country, or are they being supplied from without from surrounding nations, or it's just interesting after all these years since 1962 have been totally suppressed. The ethnic groups have broken out, and it's a very good thing to see it. I was just wondering where their weaponry may well be coming from, and where even moral support may be coming from in the conflict.
I think there are a bit of layers. First of all, the former ethnic armed groups, they also already having the weapons industry, since 70, something like that. So we can get some from them, and these people defense forces based in some liberated areas, they try to do this kind of 3D printing, and they also order the parts of the things, and they assemble as the fighting drone, something like that. That's going on. That's very fast growing industry inside the country right now. And on top of that, some weapons is illegally smuggled in from neighboring countries. That's what I believe. And on top of that, the last big layers and the influx of the very good weapons to the People Defense Forces is from the military itself, because they lost their camps. The military base has been conquered by the People Defense Forces. They got all the good weapons by the current military. So they're getting more and more weapons in that sense.
And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm sure these guys are available. They're incredible minds on all things geopolitical in Asia and Myanmar. Give them a round of applause. Thank you for coming as well.